Who knocked my dad unconscious over a trash can violation? Finds out I own their homes. Entitled people, before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. It was one of those quiet suburban neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone. Or at least, that's how it seemed. The kind of place where the lawns were neatly manicured and the streets were lined with rows of houses that looked like they could belong in a catalog. Everyone was just trying to get by, doing their best to live a peaceful, predictable life. And then there was the HOA, the Homeowners Association. The HOA was the unseen hand that guided the neighborhood, always making sure things stayed perfect. They had a list of rules, some of them reasonable, others just plain nitpicky. No lawn could have weeds. Trash bins had to be brought in by the evening after pickup. Christmas lights had to be taken down by a certain date. The HOA wasn't shy about enforcing these rules either. Fines, warnings, even threats of legal action were all part of their game plan. That's where my dad came in. He was just an average guy, minding his own business, trying to enjoy his retirement in peace. He worked hard his whole life, raised a family, and finally had some time to relax. Our house in that suburban neighborhood was supposed to be a quiet haven for him after decades of work. But in the eyes of the HOA, that peaceful life was anything but secure. One morning, my dad had just finished taking the trash cans to the curb. It wasn't a big deal. Every other house in the neighborhood had their cans out too. The pickup was scheduled for that day, and as usual, he didn't think twice. But somewhere along the line, the HOA had decided that my dad's trash cans were a violation of some obscure rule. Maybe they were out a few minutes too early, or not lined up in the approved fashion. It didn't matter that it was a harmless mistake. In the world of the HOA, those tiny infractions could cost you, and for some reason, they were out for blood. My dad was just trying to get on with his day, not realizing that something so simple, a trash can violation, was about to spiral into something much worse. It wasn't the kind of thing that should lead to trouble, not by any reasonable measure. Yet the HOA's overbearing tactics were quick to escalate, and before long, it wasn't just a fine. It became something far more dangerous. It started with something as simple as a trash can, something people don't usually give much thought to. The rule, as written by the HOA, was clear. Trash bins were only allowed on the curb from 7 a.m. on trash day until 8 p.m. Anything outside of that window was considered a violation. My dad, being the good, rule-abiding citizen that he was, made sure the cans were out early enough for pickup and brought them in promptly when it was all over. But this time, something went wrong. He'd put the cans out the night before, as he had done countless times before. The garbage pickup was scheduled for 7 a.m. on the dot, but for whatever reason, the trash didn't get picked up until later in the afternoon. In the meantime, the HOA's patrol had apparently made their rounds, and they spotted my dad's cans still sitting on the curb, well past the window, for compliance. It didn't matter that the delay was out of his control. The HOA wasn't interested in context. It was all about enforcement. The next day, we got a letter from them, a violation notice, a fine, a stern warning to make sure it didn't happen again. That's how they did things, by letter, impersonal, and cold. It wasn't just the fine that stung, though. It was the sense that my dad, a decent man who had never caused any trouble in the neighborhood, was now being treated like a criminal for something so trivial. But that wasn't the worst of it. My dad, being the person he was, wasn't one to back down. He decided he would fight the fine. He'd go to the next HOA meeting and explain what happened, hoping the board would see reason. He wasn't angry, just frustrated that something as insignificant as this could snowball into a situation that made him feel small and powerless. So he showed up at the HOA's next monthly meeting, walking in with his head held high. It was supposed to be a simple conversation, but the moment he stepped into that meeting, he could feel the tension in the air. The HOA president, a man who had made it his mission to enforce every little rule to the letter, was there, already looking at my dad with that condescending smile that made it clear he didn't plan on showing any leniency. The situation started off calm, but it quickly escalated. My dad calmly explained his case, saying he had followed the rules, that the delay in trash pickup wasn't his fault, and that he shouldn't be punished for it. But the president wasn't having it. He scoffed at my dad's reasoning, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. The other board members didn't speak up, too intimidated to go against the president's iron grip on the HOA's decisions. And then something snapped. The president, now visibly frustrated with my dad's insistence, made a sharp, dismissive comment about how some people just didn't respect the rules. That's when my dad, tired of being treated like a second-class citizen, raised his voice just a little, not in anger, more in disbelief. He asked how the HOA could be so focused on something so small while ignoring the bigger issues in the neighborhood. That's when things took a dangerous turn. The HOA president stood up, his face red with anger. He walked over to my dad, and before anyone could react, he shoved him. Hard. My dad, caught off guard, stumbled backward, tripping over a chair and hitting his head on the corner of the table. The room went silent for a moment, and then chaos erupted. Some of the board members started yelling, trying to intervene, but the damage was done. My dad was on the floor, unconscious, blood trickling from the side of his head. I wasn't there, but I can still picture it in my mind. The sound of his head hitting the ground, the horror on the faces of the neighbors who were present. The physical toll on my dad was severe. He ended up in the hospital with a concussion, bruises, and cuts. But the emotional damage, the humiliation of being knocked out by someone who was supposed to be a leader in the community, was what really crushed him. He couldn't understand how things had gotten so out of hand. How had something as small as a trash can violation turned into a violent attack? It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of abuse by the HOA. They weren't just enforcing rules. They were abusing their power, bullying anyone who didn't fall in line, using fear and intimidation to get what they wanted. The whole thing felt like a power play, and my dad, just a regular guy trying to do the right thing, had been caught in the middle. It was one thing to get a fine, but to be assaulted over something so trivial? That was beyond unfair. Homeowners associations, or HOAs, are supposed to be a way to keep neighborhoods neat and orderly. On the surface, it sounds like a good idea, ensuring that everyone follows some basic guidelines to maintain the overall appearance and value of properties. But in reality, HOAs often turn into little kingdoms of control, where the board members wield power over their neighbors, and not always for the greater good. These organizations are designed to have authority over all kinds of things in the neighborhood, whether it's the color of your house, the height of your grass, or the placement of your trash cans. On paper, it might seem like these rules exist to protect property values and maintain a certain aesthetic, but more often than not, they overreach, becoming so obsessive about tiny, insignificant details that they completely lose sight of their original purpose. What starts as an effort to make sure homes are well kept turns into a system of constant scrutiny and micromanagement. Take something as simple as trash cans. In many neighborhoods with an HOA, the rule is that cans can't stay on the curb for more than a few hours before and after pickup. It sounds reasonable at first, right? But these rules often have no room for flexibility or understanding. Maybe a pickup truck is running late, or perhaps a resident has forgotten to bring their cans in before dark. Doesn't matter. If the cans are left out even a minute too long, it's a violation. And with that violation comes the fine. A few dollars here, a few more there. But it adds up quickly, especially if you're someone who isn't in a financial position to just throw away money on fines for the most minor infractions. The HOA's ability to impose these fines is where the real danger lies. The rules might seem trivial, but the way they are enforced is anything but. The HOA often operates in a shadowy, behind-the-scenes manner, sending warning letters, imposing fines, and making demands without much transparency. They can come down hard on someone for leaving their trash can out for too long, but ignore the bigger problems in the neighborhood, like unkempt lawns or homes that clearly need repairs. The rules can be arbitrary and even contradictory, leaving residents unsure of what is actually allowed. If you live in fear of getting a violation notice every time you step outside your door, it's not hard to see how a sense of powerlessness takes over. And that's the problem with HOAs. They breed a culture of fear. People don't want to challenge them because they know what's coming. Fines, threats of legal action, or even worse, being ostracized by the neighborhood. Many residents simply comply with whatever the HOA demands, even if the rules are unreasonable or outright ridiculous. They'd rather pay the fine than risk getting on the wrong side of the board. especially when they know how quick the HOA can be to escalate things. Over time, these associations can become corrupt, their leaders using their power for personal gain or simply because they enjoy the control. The rules aren't just about keeping the neighborhood nice. They become a tool to push around people, intimidate them, and assert dominance. For people like my dad who just wanted to live a quiet life in a community he chose because of its peaceful atmosphere, this kind of unchecked authority was suffocating. And it wasn't just a matter of petty fines. It was about creating a system where compliance was more important than fairness, and the consequences for even the smallest mistake could be severe. At first, the HOA had always seemed like this faceless, impersonal entity, a group of rules and regulations that existed somewhere behind the scenes, controlling the neighborhood from a distance. The board members were just names on paper, their faces never really part of the daily lives of the residents. But as things began to unravel, I realized that the HOA wasn't some abstract, unfeeling bureaucracy. It was made up of people who lived in the same neighborhood, who walked the same streets, and who, in many cases, were just as flawed as everyone else. I remember the first time I really took a close look at the people behind the HOA. It wasn't just the board members in the meetings. It was the residents, the neighbors, the ones who seemed to have a hand in everything, even if they weren't always in charge. It was like they had this invisible power, this unspoken control over the rest of us. And it was starting to become clear who was pulling the strings. The HOA president, a man named Mark, was the first one to make himself known. He was one of those people who seemed to thrive on authority, a man whose whole persona seemed built on enforcing rules and making others comply. Mark wasn't content with simply being a figurehead. He liked being in control. His idea of leadership wasn't about fostering community. It was about asserting dominance, making sure everyone knew their place. Mark had lived in the neighborhood for years, but his reputation was less than stellar. He was a classic example of someone who loved the power that came with being in charge of an HOA. The trash can violation, my dad's violation, was just the tip of the iceberg for him. The way he reacted to my dad at that meeting, shoving him down when he tried to stand up for himself, made it clear just how far he was willing to go to maintain his authority. But what really shocked me was how Mark wasn't alone. There were others on the board, like Karen, the secretary, and Dave, the treasurer, who were equally complicit. Karen, for instance, had a reputation for being overly critical of everyone else's lawns, even though hers looked like a jungle most of the time. It was a running joke among some of the residents, but no one dared to bring it up at the HOA meetings. She'd make notes about people's gardens and paint jobs, nitpicking things that most people wouldn't even notice, all while her own house looked like it hadn't been touched in years. It was almost like she enjoyed being the self-appointed arbiter of taste, dictating what everyone else should do while conveniently ignoring her own shortcomings. Then there was Dave, the treasurer, who had a tendency to spend HOA funds on questionable projects. One year, the neighborhood pool was in desperate need of repairs, but instead of using the funds to fix it, Dave funneled money into redoing the entrance gate, a project no one asked for and no one cared about. When residents raised concerns, Dave dismissed them, saying it was a matter of curb appeal. Yet when the pool continued to fall apart, he didn't bat an eye. It wasn't about what was best for the neighborhood. It was about doing what he wanted, with no real oversight. As I began to learn more about these people, it became increasingly clear that they were not the perfect, rule-abiding residents they liked to pretend to be. Their actions spoke louder than any of the so-called community standards they preached. They were hypocrites, using their positions for personal gain or simply to flex their muscles in a way that made them feel important. And when my dad, a guy who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, who had never caused trouble, was attacked for something as small as a trash can, I realized just how far they were willing to go to make sure they stayed in control. They weren't just abusing their power over rules and regulations. They were abusing their power over people, using fear, intimidation, and a warped sense of superiority to dominate those around them. The more I learned about the HOA and the way they were running things, the more I began to realize something that changed everything. All this time I had been playing by the rules, trying to be a good neighbor, never questioning the power they had over us. But there was one thing they didn't know. something that had been hiding in plain sight. I didn't just live in the neighborhood, I owned a part of it. Actually, more than that. I owned several of the properties in the area. Properties that the HOA had never bothered to consider when they were making their decisions, their rules, their threats. It wasn't something I'd ever made public. It wasn't something I needed to flaunt. But after what happened to my dad, after the violence, the unfairness, the sheer arrogance of it all, I realized just how much power I had. Power I hadn't been using. It wasn't something that had happened overnight. Over the years, I had quietly been buying up houses in the neighborhood, one by one. At first, it was just a good investment. Properties that were undervalued or underappreciated. Real estate isn't always about the quick flip. Sometimes it's about long-term gain. And I saw the potential in this place, even though many of the homes here had been aging, falling out of style, or simply being ignored by their owners. I wasn't trying to make a scene. I was just doing what made sense. But after the incident with my dad, I started to connect the dots. The HOA, with all their rules and petty enforcement, was holding the neighborhood back. They were choking it. They were more interested in controlling people than actually building a sense of community. And that's when it hit me. Why not use my properties to my advantage? Why not level the playing field, take control of the situation, and turn the tables? It wasn't just about owning a few homes. I had a stake in the entire neighborhood. Several of the homes that Mark, Karen, Dave, and the rest of the HOA board members lived in, yeah, those were mine. They had no idea. It wasn't something I'd planned for, but it was a result of the slow, steady moves I had made over the years. I never made a big deal of it. I never flaunted the fact that I owned some of the most desirable properties in the area. But when things started going south, it became clear that this was the key to everything. The moment I realized I could use this leverage, everything changed. The dynamics shifted in my mind, and I could tell, slowly but surely, it would shift in the neighborhood. The HOA, these people who had been so quick to bully and intimidate, were no longer the ones in charge. I was. They had no idea that I controlled the very properties they called home, and that gave me something they could never take away: power. I knew the moment I walked into that meeting, the moment I finally decided to stand up and take action, things were going to be different. I wasn't just a resident anymore. I wasn't just a guy whose dad had been hurt. I was the person who could change the entire power structure, who could flip the script, who could show them what it felt like to be the one at the mercy of someone else. What would they do when they realized that I could take away everything they had? Would they still be so quick to throw their weight around? Or would they finally understand what it felt like to lose control? The days after the incident felt like they were stretched thin, each minute dragging by. My dad was still in the hospital, his head bandaged, a dull ache in his eyes every time he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Medically, the concussion was the least of it. It was the bruises on his body, the cuts on his skin, the feeling of vulnerability that wouldn't go away, no matter how much time passed. He kept replaying the event in his head, over and over, trying to understand how a simple argument about a trash can escalated into such violence. Emotionally, it was harder for him. My dad had always been a proud man. He wasn't the type to be pushed around. He'd spent his life providing for us, working tirelessly, never once thinking he'd be in a position where he had to defend himself from people he'd lived beside for years. But now he couldn't even look me in the eye without that look of hurt in his face. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the realization that the very people who were supposed to be part of his community, the ones he'd always considered his neighbors, were the ones who had turned on him. I could see it in his eyes, that spark of anger, the confusion, and the disbelief that still hadn't gone away. He didn't even know what to do. How do you respond to something like that? How do you stand up when the people in power are the ones who've just knocked you down? But for me, the aftermath was a different kind of fire burning inside. Seeing him like that, helpless and frustrated, it hit me in a way nothing else had. I felt this wave of anger rush through me, but it wasn't just for the physical harm that had been done to him. It was everything. The unfairness, the abuse of power, the fact that my dad, of all people, had been singled out for something so trivial. It wasn't right. I spent those first few days just sitting there, watching him, trying to keep the anger at bay. But it didn't work. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about me getting revenge. It wasn't about fighting for my dad or even about clearing his name. It was about stopping the cycle. It was about drawing a line in the sand and showing them, Mark, Karen, Dave, and all the rest, that their actions had consequences, that they couldn't just hide behind their authority anymore, that they were going to face what they'd done. And in that moment, I realized something else. I was the one with the power now. I had the leverage. It wasn't just about buying homes in the neighborhood anymore. It was about taking control of the situation and flipping the power dynamic. All this time, they'd been treating my family like we were beneath them, like we were nothing more than faceless residents to bully. But I wasn't going to let that stand anymore. I knew what I had to do, even if it meant exposing everything and pushing back in a way they never saw coming. The HOA didn't control the neighborhood. They only controlled what people let them. And I wasn't going to let them do this to anyone else, not after what they'd done to my dad. It felt like the weight of the world was shifting in my favor. As I stood there thinking about the power I had, I finally understood just how much I could change. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a force in this neighborhood, and they were about to find that out the hard way. Once I realized the power I had, the next step was obvious. I needed to start making strategic moves. My dad had always told me to play the long game, and now it was time to put that advice into action. I wasn't just a neighbor anymore. I was an owner. And with that ownership came the kind of leverage the HOA hadn't even begun to understand. The first thing I did was start talking to other homeowners in the area. Most of them were too scared to stand up to the HOA. They didn't want to deal with the fines, the threats, or the social consequences that came with being seen as a troublemaker. But when I started casually bringing up the way things were being run, I realized I wasn't the only one who felt this way. There were whispers of dissatisfaction, neighbors who had been fined for the smallest infractions, residents who had been bullied by Mark and his cronies, but never had the courage to speak out. The more I listened, the more I saw that there was a collective frustration building beneath the surface. I reached out to a few homeowners who seemed fed up, those who weren't afraid of a little conflict. We started meeting in private, away from the eyes of the HOA, sharing stories about the unreasonable fines and the strange rules. There was one neighbor, Frank, who had received a fine for planting flowers that clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic. Another, Susan, had been fined for leaving her garage door open for more than an hour. Little things that no one else would care about, but the HOA used them as an excuse to flex their power. It was clear that this wasn't just a few isolated incidents. This was a pattern of bullying and control. The more we compared notes, the more I realized that the HOA wasn't about maintaining any kind of standard. It was about power, about making sure they had the final say in everything. The next move was about gathering evidence. I knew the HOA had been making shady decisions, but I needed more than just accusations. I needed hard proof. I started paying closer attention to the way they conducted their meetings, the things they said when they thought no one was listening. I took notes during every HOA session, recorded conversations when I could, and began to piece together a picture of corruption. It wasn't hard to find discrepancies, rules that were ignored for certain residents, fines that seemed to appear out of nowhere, and decisions that only seemed to benefit the board members themselves. One thing that stuck out to me was the way Mark and the others treated the finances. They had been redirecting funds into projects that no one asked for, luxury landscaping in their own backyards, renovations to common areas that didn't need any work, all while ignoring the needs of the rest of the neighborhood. It wasn't just the fines or the power trips, it was theft, plain and simple. Once I had enough evidence, I reached out to the local press. I wasn't interested in a quiet, behind-the-scenes fight. I wanted everyone to know what was going on. The more people who knew, the harder it would be for the HOA to dismiss us. I also started making connections with local government officials, quietly making them aware of the HOA's practices. I didn't want to go into this blindly. I needed to be sure I had the legal and social backing to hold them accountable. And then there was the final step. I began laying the groundwork to expose the HOA board members, particularly Mark, Karen, and Dave. They had been running this show for too long, taking advantage of their position, and it was time for them to face the consequences. I had the leverage now, not just as a resident, but as someone who could shape the future of the neighborhood. The properties I own weren't just about real estate anymore. They were a tool, a means to an end. I started working on a plan that would make sure the HOA couldn't ignore what was coming. The idea was simple: disrupt their grip on the neighborhood by getting enough support behind me. I wanted the other homeowners to see that they didn't have to live in fear, that they had a choice. And once that happened, the HOA would be exposed for what they truly were: corrupt, power-hungry, and abusing their position to control people's lives. By the time I was ready to take action, I had everything in place: the evidence, the support, the leverage. I was ready to turn the tables. The HOA thought they were in control, but it was my turn now. And I wasn't going to stop until they paid for what they'd done to my dad, and to all of us. The moment of confrontation came sooner than I expected. I had been laying the groundwork for weeks, gathering my evidence, building support, and putting everything into motion. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I also knew that it had to happen face to face. The HOA board couldn't keep hiding behind their rules and their petty power trips once I made my move. It wasn't just any meeting, it was the meeting. The monthly HOA gathering was scheduled, and I decided it would be the perfect time to confront them. The agenda was supposed to cover typical neighborhood concerns: potholes, landscaping contracts, the usual mundane topics. But I had a different agenda, one that no one in that room saw coming. I walked in with a calm that felt like the eye of a storm. My heart was racing, but I kept my face neutral, making sure to keep the upper hand. This was my moment. The room went silent when I entered. They had no idea what I had planned. I could see Mark, Karen, and Dave at the front of the room, all gathered at the long table like they always were, looking smug, like they owned the place. But that's the thing. They did own the place. At least they thought they did. I could see the subtle shifts in their posture as they noticed I was carrying a binder full of documents. Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly trying to gauge what I was up to. I didn't waste any time. I stood at the front of the room and placed the binder on the table with a deliberate thud. The sound was sharp, cutting through the tension in the air. "I think it's time we had a little talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. The room held its breath, waiting for me to continue. And I did. I started with the trash can incident. I laid out the facts: how my dad had been assaulted, how the rules had been abused, how the HOA's actions weren't just a matter of petty fines, but a blatant overstep of power. I looked right at Mark as I spoke, his face going a little pale as he realized I wasn't just venting frustration. I had evidence. I pulled out emails, notes from residents, recordings, and even financial statements that showed just how corrupt things had gotten. Their reactions were priceless. Mark tried to interrupt, but I cut him off, showing them how their precious neighborhood standards were a smokescreen for their personal agendas. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her usual smug expression fading as I detailed how the HOA had been mismanaging funds, funding pet projects for themselves while the neighborhood fell into disrepair. Davy, who had always been the quiet one, suddenly seemed much smaller, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the truth. I could feel the power shift with every word I spoke. They had spent so long controlling the narrative, making residents fear them, bullying people into submission. But now the tables were flipped. The room was electric with tension as they tried to regain their composure. But it was too late. They knew they couldn't just ignore me. Finally, I laid out the consequences. I told them exactly what I was going to do. First, I was going to lead a petition to recall the board members. That would be the start. Then I would take legal action: citizens' complaints, public records requests, the works. If they didn't step down voluntarily, they'd be looking at public exposure, fines, and possibly lawsuits. I didn't care what it took. I had the support of the other homeowners behind me, and they knew it. The room was silent for a moment, and I watched them scramble for their words. Mark tried to recover, but his bravado was gone. Karen, who had always loved to make snide comments about the troublemakers in the neighborhood, couldn't even look me in the eye anymore. Dave, normally quiet and calculated, finally spoke up, his voice shaky. You don't have the authority to do this." I smiled, leaning forward. Funny, I was under the impression that I owned a significant portion of this neighborhood, including the homes you all live in. So actually, I do have the authority, I suggest you start thinking about your next move. The fear was palpable now. The control they had enjoyed for so long was slipping through their fingers. They were cornered, and they knew it. This wasn't just a negotiation. This was a fight for their positions, for their power, and they were losing. Mark's face turned red as he tried to regain his composure, but the damage had been done. The meeting ended in chaos, with board members bickering among themselves, trying to figure out how to salvage what was left of their authority. But I knew it was over. They had lost. They couldn't pretend anymore that they were the ones in charge. I had made sure of that. Walking out of the meeting, I felt a strange kind of satisfaction. It wasn't just about getting revenge for my dad or putting an end to the corruption. It was about reclaiming control of a space that had been dominated by fear for far too long. And as the doors closed behind me, I knew that the neighborhood was never going to be the same again. The fallout from that showdown didn't take long to unfold. The HOA members were reeling, scrambling to figure out how to salvage their positions, but they were already too far gone. The shock on their faces during the meeting had been enough to signal that they knew they had lost their grip on power, but it wasn't just about losing a position, it was about the consequences that came with it. Mark, Karen, and Dave tried to fight back in the days after the meeting. At first, they attempted to rally support within the HOA, but their influence was weakening by the hour. More and more residents began to speak up, and the whispers of corruption and abuse of power grew louder. The petition I'd launched gained traction quickly. Homeowners who had been too afraid to confront the board were now finding their voices. People were tired of being intimidated. The board members tried to stand their ground, but it became clear that their reign was ending. Within a few weeks, Mark and Karen were forced to step down from their positions. Karen tried to spin it as a personal decision, but there was no hiding the fact that the pressure was too much. She was the first to resign, likely seeing the writing on the wall. Dave, the quieter one, was next. He barely put up a fight. He had never been as invested in the HOA's power struggles as the others, but his hands were tied. He had no support, no one left to back him up. It wasn't just about stepping down, it was about accountability. I had reached out to local authorities, presenting the evidence I'd gathered, and while the process wasn't swift, it was inevitable. The corruption and the misuse of funds could no longer be ignored. Mark especially faced legal consequences. The press picked up on the story, and it became clear that his actions were being scrutinized not just by residents, but by the local government as well. His ties to shady financial dealings, using HOA funds for personal projects, were uncovered. He was fined, and there was talk of possible further investigation into his personal finances. The HOA was dissolved temporarily while a new board was formed, one with a much more transparent approach. The neighborhood, too, was transformed in ways I hadn't anticipated. Some residents were ecstatic. They felt empowered, as if the neighborhood had finally broken free from the shackles of fear and manipulation. They started organizing more community events, revitalizing parts of the neighborhood that had been neglected for years. People were more willing to speak up now, to challenge decisions, to ask questions. The sense of camaraderie that had been missing returned. It felt like a weight had been lifted from the entire community. But not everyone was thrilled. Some residents, especially those who had enjoyed the protection the HOA had offered, were skeptical of the changes. They didn't like the idea of the HOA being overhauled, and they felt uncomfortable with the idea of a new power structure emerging. Some were even hesitant to fully embrace the changes, afraid that without the HOA's iron grip, things would descend into chaos. But as time went on, most of them came around, realizing that they had been living under a system that didn't serve their best interests. There were, of course, those who remained quiet, still fearful of rocking the boat. They'd been bullied by the old HOA for so long that they weren't ready to jump into the fray, even with things shifting in their favor. But they didn't have to anymore. The simple act of knowing that someone was willing to stand up for them made a world of difference. They didn't have to fight. They didn't have to take the risks. They had witnessed someone else do it, and that gave them hope that they wouldn't have to live in fear anymore. As for me, the whole experience changed how I viewed the neighborhood. It wasn't just about taking down the HOA, it was about showing people that they didn't have to be passive. They didn't have to accept being pushed around. I didn't do it for glory. But the fact that I could make a difference was something I carried with me. I didn't have to own the entire neighborhood to be in control of the situation. I just had to make sure that the power was in the right hands. And in the end, the real victory wasn't just about seeing Mark and the others face the consequences for their actions. It was about the community waking up to the fact that they could demand better. The HOA might have been toppled, but the real change was in how the neighborhood functioned after that. People were more aware, more engaged, and more willing to fight for what was right. And that was something no one, not even the former board members, could ever take away. In the end, the whole experience left me with a deeper understanding of how power can be abused, but also how it can be challenged. For so long, the HOA had used its position to intimidate and control the neighborhood, making people feel powerless. They relied on fear to maintain their hold, on the belief that no one would ever have the courage to stand up to them. But I learned something important, that abuse of power doesn't last forever. It only survives when people let it. One person can make a difference, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against them. The key is to find your strength, to understand that you don't need to accept the status quo if it's wrong. I never thought I would be the one to take that stand. But when my dad was hurt, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the whole neighborhood, about the people who were too scared to speak out, about the ones who thought they had no voice. I realized that standing up for my dad meant standing up for all of us. And when I did, the power dynamics shifted. I saw that fear had a way of clouding people's judgment, of keeping them in line. But when the fear was gone, when people saw that change was possible, they rallied together. They found their own strength. And that was something I could never have imagined at the start of all this. As for my dad, his recovery was slow, but in many ways it was also transformative. He was never one for big displays of emotion, but when the pressure on the HOA started to mount, I saw a glimmer of pride in his eyes that hadn't been there before. For so long, he had been the one trying to protect us, trying to shield us from the world's unfairness. But in the end, I was the one who protected him. It wasn't just about the physical recovery, it was about the emotional weight he had carried for so long, the sense that maybe this world wasn't as just as he had hoped. Watching how I stood up for him, how I took control of the situation, I think it changed his perspective. He began to see that things didn't have to stay the way they were. He wasn't as cynical about the world, not as defeated by the unfairness he had felt before. And for me, it was more than just a victory over the HOA. It was a victory over fear. For years, I had watched people get pushed around by those in power, too afraid to fight back, too intimidated by the consequences. But I knew then that power, when it's abused, can be taken back. It's not always easy, and it doesn't come without cost, but it's always possible. What I did for my dad, for our family, and for the neighborhood, it was all about taking control. It was about deciding that I wasn't going to let anyone dictate my fate. I wasn't going to sit by and watch as the people I loved got hurt by those who thought they were above the law. I learned that taking control of your destiny is never a passive act. It requires courage, resolve, and the willingness to stand up, even when you're scared, even when you feel alone. In the end, I wasn't just fighting for my dad's recovery. I was fighting for something bigger. The idea that we don't have to let power go unchecked, that we can challenge what's wrong, and that we can make a difference. It's a lesson I'll carry with me forever. That one person, when they have the courage to act, can change the course of a story. And that's exactly what I did.